You see, rock and roll isn't a career or hobby, it's a life force. It's something very essential. The old-timers schooled me good. They brainwashed me to respect music, whether we were playing rockabilly or blues or rock and roll. Rock and roll was a revelation for me. If you live in rock and roll, as I do, you see the reality of sex, of male lust and women being aroused by male lust. It attracts women. It doesn't repel them. I'm not someone who gets to play the O2 and places like that, but that's the kind of rock and roll venue. The popularity of stand-up means that some people are getting to play rock star venues. I worked with Dionne Warwick, did shows with Bette Midler, and then I did the 25th anniversary of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with Springsteen at the Garden. It was all important stuff because you want people to know you can work, you can sing, and you can still look good. I am fascinated by the places that music comes from, like fife and drum blues from southern Mississippi or Cajun music out of Lafayette, Louisiana, shape note singing, old harp singing from the mountains. I love that stuff. It's like the beginning of rock and roll, something comes down from the hills, and something comes up from the delta. I grew up on the precursors to rock and roll, rhythm and blues. Rock and roll stars have it much better than writers when they're on a tour. Sex and drugs and rock and roll. A more important reason is that the bands will intuitively trust someone they think is a peer, and who speaks fondly of the same formative rock and roll experiences. I made that decision around the time of Halloween, whether I wanted to continue trying to be a singer and rock and roll player or get into movies. Some have called we rock and roll performers who never retire, troubadours. I enjoy this misnomer immensely. While there are many differences between me and my distant predecessors in L'Occitane, I do believe there is a lineage that connects us of the last 70 years with those romantic singers of the high Middle Ages. If you truly dig what you are doing, if you lay it out that way, nobody can not respond. That's what rock and roll is, it's relentless. Classical music is for listening, but rock and roll is to have fun with. Rock and roll is here to stay. If you're trying to get to the underworld of Berlin, it's not suits and ties, it's rock and roll. The biggest problem in rock journalism is that often the writer's main motivation is to become friends with the band. They're not really journalists, they're people who want to be involved in rock and roll. I'm the greatest rock and roll drummer on the planet and you suck. I know I'm not Freddie Mercury or Owen Wilson, and that's okay. You don't have to be a great singer to sing rock and roll. That's not what it's about. What would rock and roll be without ambition, craziness, danger, and fun? Rock and roll has no beginning and no end, for it is the very pulse of life itself. I think the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, first of all, has got to be put into the context of being an American cultural showcase. It's there to be a museum showcase of all that's great about American music. If you don't know the blues, there's no point in picking up the guitar and playing rock and roll or any other form of popular music. It was always my belief that rock and roll belonged in the hands of the people, not rock stars. I am one of the barbarians. I love rock and roll. Rock and roll has probably given more than it's taken. Elvis may be the king of rock and roll, but I am the queen. I'm ready to rock and roll. The 60s are gone, dope will never be as cheap, sex never as free, and the rock and roll never as great. My dad is a huge rock and roll lead guitar fan. I didn't even really know that until recently. Everything has to have a guitar solo in it. I was always drawn to gospel music and the roots of African American music. It's the foundation of rock and roll. Every 15, 20, 25 years, a new rock and roll record needs to come out and a new rock and roll band needs to come out. It's only rock and roll, my God. It's not rocket science. Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue with that. I'm right and I will be proved right. We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. My dad was one of the reasons I got into rock and roll, because I was learning the ropes of his business, which was selling power tools, and I was looking for a way out from under his heel. I was like, where's the fun? Where's the glamour? If you tried to give rock and roll another name, you might call it Chuck Berry. What are the symbols of American strength, wealth, power and modernity? Certainly not jazz and rock and roll, not chewing gum or hamburgers, Broadway or Hollywood. It's their skyscrapers, their Pentagon, their science, their technology. I always felt rock and roll was very, very wholesome music. People who got on their feet and freaked about were called idiot dancers. And nobody wants to be called an idiot dancer. But the whole idea of rock and roll is to get people off their arses, that's what it's about. All of a sudden, someone threw me in front of this rock and roll band, and I decided then and there that was it. I never wanted to do anything else. Energy is so important. If you don't have it, don't bother with rock and roll. Rock and roll is not an instrument. Rock and roll isn't even a style of music. Rock and roll is a spirit that's been going since the blues, jazz, bebop, soul, R&B, heavy metal, punk rock and, yes, hip-hop. I'm from Italy, but when I'm in LA, I dress a little bit rock and roll. There's always people saying that rock is dead, rock is over. People are always out to kill rock and roll. Rock and roll music, the music of freedom, frightens people and unleashes all manner of conservative defense mechanisms. Kane is a band I formed with my best friend Steve Carlson. We just got together and started playing guitar. He was playing some old school rock and roll, and we got together and thought, hey, let's take this on the road. Authentic rock and roll is a sound that I've always been drawn to with bands like Brand New and Jimmy Eat World. I loved rock and roll when that came in, Bill Haley, Little Richard, Fats Domino, Buddy Holly, Elvis Presley, all those great records. So I begged my mom and dad for a guitar, which eventually they did get me for Christmas, but it went out of tune very quickly, and it hurt my fingers. I'm a rock and roll kid, but to me, rock and roll isn't just for idiots banging their instruments really loud. Visit our website for more quotes, quoting.com.